With that, I will hand it over to Deputy County Manager Jimmy Giese.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar on the Cobb County ARPA application public submission process. As you mentioned, my name is Jimmy Giese, and I'm the Deputy County Manager for Cobb County Government. One of the roles of my position with the county is to oversee capital spending programs, such as our ARPA program. We're excited for the launch of this application and look forward to sharing more today about how to apply for these American Rescue Plan Act recovery funds. The county's worked to design a public application process that leverages your creativity and expertise to identify projects that meet Cobb County community's needs. Again, thank each of you for taking the time to be here and bringing your questions about the application to this call. We look forward to seeing your submissions over the next few months. And with that, I'll pass it off to Stephanie Chang with Deloitte Consulting, who is supporting us in this process. She will walk you through a brief presentation on the application, and then we'll take questions that you may have. Steph, it's all yours.
Great, thank you, Jimmy, and thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. As Jimmy noted, we can go ahead to the next slide. We'll spend the first part of this webinar just giving some context and talking about the guidelines for the projects and what Cobb County is looking for project applications on. Talk a little bit about the contents of the application itself and how that review and evaluation process will work. And then we'll want to hold time, we've got 20 minutes scheduled here. Hopefully we'll have a little bit more time than that, just to answer any questions that you have. So we've been receiving questions from the ARPA@cobbcounty.org email inbox. So we'll have a couple questions teed up from that, and then feel free to use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and we will answer them as you receive them. And we will have a record of who's submitted which questions, so if we don't get to yours, we can follow up with you individually as well. Okay. So let's go forward. So just to remind us of where we're at in this process. So the government passed the American Rescue Plan Act, which provided funding to Treasury, and Treasury's created the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, which is for counties and local governments to create programming that addresses the needs of their communities that have been related to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So specifically, Cobb County is receiving just a little bit over $147 million. Half of that's in hand, and then half of that should be coming shortly. The plan was for Treasury to send half of that last year, and then half of it a year later, which is about right now. So as I said, the guidance that's provided notes that this funding really should be directed towards supporting the recovery from the impacts of the pandemic. And Cobb County has taken the very general guidance that Treasury has provided and gone through a process to gather a lot of input from the community. There's a community needs survey last November, you may recall. Also talked to nonprofits, business leaders, community organization leaders, political leaders in the county, just to get a good gauge of what the needs were. And then the board, this was distilled and analyzed, and then the board approved a set of Cobb County specific priorities and subtopics, which we'll get into a little bit later. So this is kind of the scope for what these project applications can cover. The project application that just opened up last Monday, this is open to anyone who would like to submit an idea that benefits residents of Cobb County. We recognize that there will be organizations that have specific project ideas that they want to submit, and also maybe individuals who may not have the power of an organization behind them, but have a strong idea and want to put that forth as well. So both of those are encouraged. And the application also allows for collaboration. So if there's a group, a partnership, a consortium of organizations that wants to work together to put together an application, that's also possible as well. Some very high level kind of context on the application. It will be open for 3 months, so wrapping up on September 9th at 5 p.m. I do want to note that the applications will be reviewed on a rolling basis, and as they're reviewed, they will be gradually evaluated and teed up to the board for approval. So the funding that currently has been allocated that may get allocated between now and September 9th. All the decision making won't be held until September 9th. So just keep that in mind as you're spending time putting your application together. And then finally, come September 9th, if there is still funding that remains at that time, then the Board of Commissioners will determine what the path forward is there, right? They may, and this is, again, it's up to the board, but they may decide to extend that application window. If the funding that remains is really focused in a couple of key areas, they may issue a little bit more focused process around that, but that's for their determination come September 9th. Okay, let's go ahead and step forward, and I can talk about the investment priorities. So this is, as I said, where the county took the very general guidance that Treasury provided of what are all the ways that are eligible that you can spend this money, and then tailored it based on all the needs that the county gathered and analyzed and distilled. So there's 5 priority areas, which are these broad rectangles that you see here: community health, support services, economic development, county infrastructure, and public safety. And within each one of these priority areas, there's a number of subtopics. You can see them detailed on the screen, which just breaks down that priority area into a little bit more specific topics. And if you look at the online application, each of these has a brief one-line description, just to give you a little bit further context of what the county is looking for and intending by each one of these subtopics. Also, if you look on the Cobb County ARPA website, and we'll share the links for this in the Q&A, in case you haven't been able to locate these on the county's website. There's documents there which provide information on the process that was used to gather all of these needs and sort of synthesize all of this. And that information that just provides more detail about each one of these is also there. In the application itself, the very upfront section provides that brief definition of each one of these subtopic areas, as well as what the approved allocation is. So, on that previous slide, when I said the county has received 147 million, well, specific amounts have been targeted to each one of these subtopics, and that information is right up front in the application, just to give you some guidelines on what it is that you can apply for. All right, let's go ahead to the next slide. So first I want to cover just at a high level, just what the criteria and instructions are. So you'll see on the left side, this is some of the criteria for the submissions. We're looking for, as this funding is intended to benefit Cobb County, we're looking for projects that indeed focus on Cobb County residents. We're looking for ideas that align with one of those 5 priority areas on the previous slide. And ideally, and there's a place in the application to mark this, it would align with one of the subtopics as well, just so you can show how this fits with what the board has approved for spending. One of the fundamental criteria is that the projects need to benefit people who have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. You'll see here it says impacted or disproportionately impacted. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the details of the application. Considering equity, equity is an imperative that's laid out in the ARPA guidance. So it's encouraged that equity is taken into consideration where possible. And equity in the ARPA context, it's really thinking about those communities and populations that may have traditionally not had the same access to services. And the rationale there is that those communities may have been a little bit more disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So, while the fundamental criteria is the project needs to benefit someone who's been impacted by the pandemic, special consideration can also be given towards those who maybe have been a little more disproportionately impacted or traditionally disadvantaged. Okay, so that's some of the criteria on the left side there. And that's also included in the application itself, right up front in the introduction. On the right side, just talking a little bit about some of the instructions. So when you complete the application, please complete it in its entirety. We may not be able to evaluate incomplete applications, and so please do try and fill out every field that's in there. Include as much detail as possible in order to leave flexibility for both organizations and individuals with ideas. We did work to design the application to be a little bit flexible and to have some kind of broad questions and criteria that are in there. But the more detail you can provide will help the county to better evaluate and understand the design of your project. And then finally, provide contact information. So there are a couple points in the process where the county will be in touch with you once you submit an application. And so without that contact information, or if that contact information is incorrect, then we won't be able to do that. Okay. And this last point, I just want to note, so if in your application, you can demonstrate that you have the capacity to execute the project, that will certainly receive a little bit of priority. And this essentially means if you're associated with an organization that has expertise in this area, has a track record in this area, and you can demonstrate that will give you a little bit of priority. That said, we also recognize that there are many individuals in the community who have expertise and who have great ideas, who may not currently be associated with an organization. So we're still interested to hear those ideas. The county may work to find an entity that has some capacity to implement if they decide that that's an idea that they're interested to pursue. Okay, but I just do want to note that a little bit of priority will be given to those who can implement. Okay, let's go ahead to the next slide. And here I'll go over the sections of the application itself. And the application, as I noted before, it's available on the county website. There's an online form that can be completed and submitted that way. I'll just note that if you would prefer a PDF version of the application or the application in Spanish, then please send us an email at arpa@cobbcounty.org, and we'll follow up with you directly to provide that. So the application consists of an introduction and then 4 sections. The introduction has very light context, sort of as I've just recapped here. And then it also includes that information about the 5 priority areas, the subtopics in each of the priority areas, the approved allocation amounts, so the dollars that are associated with each subtopic. It contains the submission criteria and the application instructions that I just walked through. And it also includes the evaluation criteria. We'll cover that right after this section, actually, in the webinar, so that you'll have a sense of how your applications will be evaluated. But I just want to note that all of that is upfront in the application online. So if you didn't catch the detail here, it's all written out for you in the introduction to the application. Okay. Right, now let's step through the 4 sections of the application. So if we can go forward to the next slide, please. The first section is general applicant information and eligibility. So this is going to include the project name, your name as the contact person, and contact information for the project, and then some high-level project information. So we'd like you to include here just what the requested amount of funding is, what the duration of the project, so when you anticipate starting and then when you anticipate finishing, so approximately how long the project would run for. I do want to note that all ARPA funds must be spent by the end of December 2026. So there is a little bit of runway between now and then, but we are not looking for projects that would go on in perpetuity or would be sort of longer term in nature. This is a pretty focused effort, kind of trying to focus a little bit more on acute recovery. There's also the opportunity in this section to note if you're applying as an individual or as an organization. And if you are applying as an organization, there will be some additional questions just about background around the organization. If you're an individual, you don't need to complete those. In this section, we'll also ask you to indicate how your project, so where your project aligns with the county priorities and subtopics, just to help us do that mapping. And then finally, we'll ask for a brief summary of the project. So something on the order of about 50 to 250 words, not looking for a very long narrative, but a high-level overview of what your project will aim to do, what you're trying to achieve through that project. All right, let's go to the next section, which will provide a little bit more details on the project scope. So the scope that we're looking for, this is basically the description of the project activities. So a little bit of a narrative or a list of what you would be doing over the course of the project. We'll ask for the timeline here, and then also a budget, just to show the breakdown of how you would spend the funding that you're requesting. There's the opportunity to upload additional documents if you would like. And again, keeping in mind that it may be helpful to provide a little bit more detail if you feel like that will help the county to more fully understand the details of your project. We'll also be asking if there's other funding that you plan to use in conjunction with the ARPA funds from the county. We recognize that many organizations, for example, may already have programs or activities that are in flight that align with these priority areas and subtopics, and this funding could be used to augment those or maybe to help fill in funding gaps for that. And so we can provide a little bit of detail on that here. We'll ask about whether there's any ongoing costs that you anticipate as a result of the project. I want to note that the ARPA funding, it's one-time funding. It's wonderful that the county has received this now, but after the second tranche comes in and the county has its $147 million, it's not getting any more money under ARPA. And so we don't want to create, or if you anticipate that your project will have ongoing expenses and needs, out beyond that 2026 window, we want to understand how you've considered that and taken that into account. Finally, in this section, we'll also ask a little bit about potential project risks. So it's not a bad thing if your project has risks. We understand that any kind of project implementation will have some level of risk. What we're looking for here really is we want a sense of how you've considered just the practical implications of what it is that your project aims to do, and whether you've done any planning to reasonably manage those risks where possible. Right. Okay. Let's go ahead to section 3. Here's where we'll start to look at those targeted populations who you're really looking to serve. So as I noted, equity is a focus of the ARPA legislation, and so in the legislation itself, it notes and recognizes that there may be certain populations that are more particularly have been more acutely affected, or may have traditionally kind of been underserved, which may have put them in a more vulnerable position to manage through the pandemic. And so that may be certain ethnic groups, certain populations in certain geographic areas, populations with certain income levels. So there's a lot of different ways to look at it, and that's laid out in this section here. This section asks questions about how you've considered equity in your project design. Depending on what your project aims to do, we realize that there may be different ways that equity comes into play. So this is not a one-size-fits-all. We're looking for how you thought about where it's relevant and where it applies to what you're trying to do. I want to call it, there's one question specifically in this section that asks for, it defines certain types of impacted or disproportionately impacted populations. I had noted this earlier, and these defined categories are provided by Treasury to kind of as a proxy, a way to quickly recognize some groups that may be impacted or very heavily impacted, so disproportionately impacted. These groups are not meant to be comprehensive though. There's certainly many other populations that may be impacted, disproportionately impacted, that aren't covered by the options that are teed up here. And so on this question, there's an option for you to say, not any of these groups, but to provide detail on how the group that you are trying to target has been impacted. So please recognize with that question, if your project isn't targeting one of those particular groups, that isn't disqualifying. That's simply just going to ask you for a little bit more information. All right, and then here we'll ask you to provide just a very quick, brief description of the impact that you're trying to have, what that positive impact is to Cobb County. That tees up our next section. We can go to section 4, and here's where we'll go into the impact in more detail and ask you to provide more detail on that. So performing the activities that's in your scope, that's one part of it. And then doing a little bit of monitoring or measuring of what outcomes you're having, that's another part of it. And so here we're asking you to define some performance indicators, provide a little bit more description about the impact that you're trying to have. If your application is a collaborative application where you're working with a partner organization or multiple organizations are working together, this is the section in which you would note that. If you are submitting a collaborative application, in addition to noting who the partners are here, you'll want to make sure that in the previous sections though, that you are making clear kind of which organization is responsible for what parts of the work, just to help give the county an understanding again of what your project is, what you plan to do, how you plan to implement it. All right, let's go ahead to the next slide. I'm going to talk about the evaluation review, the application review and evaluation process now. So we have a 3-step process here. Once your application is submitted, you'll receive an acknowledgement that it's been received. And then it will first just go through a review just to make sure that the application is complete, that it can move forward in the process, and also that the project that is described is ARPA eligible. So here we'll be looking to make sure that it aligns with one of those county identified priorities and subtopics, and then also from that broader ARPA perspective, that it's indeed an eligible expense. Those applications will then move forward to evaluation. The evaluation criteria I'll cover on the next slide. And this evaluation is a little bit more detailed look across the project planning, across the potential impact, and also the county priorities that they've identified. And then finally, a subset of applications will emerge from the evaluation and move to the board for approval. And so if your application will move forward, you'll be notified at this time before it goes to the board for approval. And ultimately, the decisions of how the funding will be distributed those will be made by the board. Let's go ahead to the next slide, and I'll give an overview of the evaluation criteria. So as I noted, if you'd like to take a closer look at these are available upfront in the online application, or if you request the PDF application, they're also in that upfront introduction section. So the criteria that are laid out here, these will be consistently used to evaluate all of the applications that are deemed complete and ARPA eligible. As I said, the criteria, they kind of span a couple of areas. So there's the project planning, just the robustness and the detail of your planning. So that's the risk mitigation, the budget, the project plan. There's also the impact that your project will have. How will it benefit Cobb residents? And how effectively do you think it will achieve that? And that will be detailed through the impact, through equity, through KPIs. And then finally, the county identified a number of priorities that it had, and that's financial continuity and leverage. Impact is one of those as well, but that's covered in element impact. And this was just looking at how does this project create any ongoing financial obligations for the organization or for the county? Does this project and the funding that would be provided through ARPA help to accelerate other funding that may already be in flight? So just how can this ARPA funding be used in a really additive or catalytic kind of way? So if that applies to your project, then that will be considered as part of the evaluation. All of these criteria will be weighted equally. All applications will be scored against the same set of criteria, and that's ultimately how the recommended set of projects would be developed to go to the board. Let's go ahead and step forward to the timeline. Next slide. Again, just want to reiterate some of these key dates. So application is currently open, will remain open through September 9th. At 5 p.m. is when the application window will close. Although, as I noted before, if there's funding that remains, the board will decide how they'd like to manage that. And then on a rolling basis, just to cover those next two rows. So, yeah, final recommendations, those will be decided on by the board. And the way those recommendations will make it to the board is the applications will be reviewed on a rolling basis, evaluated, scored against those criteria that I just stepped through. And then as they're ready, sets of recommended projects will go before the board between now and September 9th, and then if needed, a little bit of time beyond September 9th just to finish that board approval process. That's the timeline that we're looking at. You'll see it here at the bottom of this slide, and we will put it in the Q&A as well, so people have it. The URL you see there, cobbcounty.org/ARPA, that's the county's site for kind of like your one-stop shop for all county-specific ARPA information. You can find the link to the application there. You can find the FAQs that accompany the application there. You can also find, it's called the Investment Guidance and Principles Report. And it's a document that compiles, basically the process up until this point. It provides the background of how the county arrived at its approved set of priority areas and subtopics and allocations. The email address that's there is if you have any additional questions. We've still got half of this webinar to cover questions, but if there's anything else, then please do reach out via that email. Okay, let's step forward and we can shift over to questions. And I know we've got our team in the background here has been capturing the questions that you've been sharing. And so I'll just start to work through those. Let me see here. Okay. So the first question, can a nonprofit that resides outside of Cobb County apply for these funds, but they serve residents of Cobb County? So yes, organizations that are outside of Cobb County may submit an application as long as the project funding and the benefits would target Cobb County residents and communities. That's a little bit up to the county, how they would want to evaluate from there, but the main criteria there is that it benefits Cobb County and its residents, so that would be that would be eligible. Okay, next question. If applications are reviewed and approved on a rolling basis, does that potentially allow for all or significant funding to be allocated prior to September 9th? Yes, that is a possibility. So the county is prioritizing high quality applications, but naturally applications that are submitted sooner in the process may be more likely to receive funding just due to this rolling review. That said, the county is cognizant that it takes a little bit of time to put together applications. And so, while it's doing this rolling review, it's not obligated to tee up a certain number or a certain dollar amount of recommendations to the board on a regular basis. So there is a little bit of leeway there, but we do encourage you to try and get your applications together as soon as possible. The benefit of that is you get your application in sooner, it will go through this review sooner, and you may get your answer on whether your project is recommended to the board or potentially approved sooner as well and get those funds in hand. Okay. Is there a way to update an application that's already been submitted? I think it depends on how extensive are the updates that you'd like to make. So if there's a couple of minor details that you're looking to update, then go ahead and email us at ARPA@cobbcounty.org, detailing the changes, and we can work with you to get that updated. If the changes are more extensive, I think it may be more straightforward to just go ahead and submit a new application through the online application portal. And if on the back end, as we're reviewing, if there's multiple applications that are received, same project name, same contact info, we'll take the latest submission as the one to be reviewed. And if there's any clarification that we need, we'll reach out using your contact info. Okay. And again, another question, are applications being reviewed and awarded now or starting after the September 9th due date? So applications will be reviewed as they're received, and then recommendations will be teed up to the board on a rolling basis. It is ultimately the board's decision what they want to approve and move forward to fund. But if there are quality applications that come in early in the process, then as the county evaluates those, if they make the recommendation to the board, then the board may choose to approve those certainly before the September 9th date. Okay. Next question. Should a small business owner under or through which their proposed program will be developed and managed apply as an individual or an organization? So apply as an organization, fill in your name and your contact information. We may get in touch with you if there's any clarification that's needed there. And one distinction I want to make, so the application at this time, it's designed for kind of programmatic approaches. So this application is not intended for an individual household or an individual business to apply for. That said, there is funding that available that could benefit households and could benefit small businesses. What we're looking for there is, if there's an organization that, for example, would want to do a small business support program or a household support program, and then they can administer the funds to individual businesses or the individual households, but the county itself won't be making those individual grants. Okay, the next question that we've received, what kind of consideration will be given for those applying as an individual for large scope projects, considering the administration of the grant? So, e.g., expected to work with an organization, able to work with an individual contractor, etc. So, in general, if you're an individual, and at this time you don't have like an organization that's like already identified to work with you, then submit your project idea as an individual. If you have an organization in mind or some entity that you would plan to work with to implement the program, then submit the application under that partner organization. And if there's a little bit more specifics that you have with this question or with any of these questions, please send us an email to arpa@cobbcounty.org and we can give you a little bit more specific answer. Just maybe if we can connect and get a little bit more specific information from you, we may be able to help provide a more specific answer. Okay, next question. How soon will funding be awarded and how will it be dispersed in considering the applicant may be paying third-party vendors to help facilitate parts of the project? Okay, so at this time, I would say the disbursement of funds depends ultimately on when the board approves projects for funding. So as a whole, looking at the full pot of funding that's currently available under these 5 priority areas and these subtopics, the county is looking to approve and distribute those funds before the end of the year. If for your individual project, it's hard to say what that exact timeline would be. It depends when your application comes in, and as we noted, because these approvals have to go to the board and the board is meeting on a 2-week cadence, it would depend when if it makes it through to the recommendation stage, when it would go before the board. But pretty shortly after the board approves, so assume the board approves your project is recommended, goes to the board approves it, there would be a brief kind of contracting period when we just need to get the paperwork and agreements in place with you, and then the funding would be dispersed shortly after that. So hard to give a little bit more specific answer, but that's what the sequence would be. Okay. And depending on the nature of your project, because it depends if it's a multi-year project, if it's a short-term project, the funding could be dispersed in a number of different ways, right? So smaller projects might receive a lump sum, larger projects or longer duration projects might receive the funding in tranches. It depends a little bit on the specifics of what you're proposing. Okay, next question. Can the proposal budget be established for multiple years? So for example, 2023, 24, 25 through 26. Yes, definitely. And that level of detail would be helpful for the county as they evaluate the application. So you can indicate in your timeline the time periods that you're requesting specific funding, just to, again, provide that more detailed understanding. As long as, across all of those years, whatever the year breakdown is, it adds up to that total amount that you're requesting. The allocations, I want to say, that are noted up front in the application, those aren't just for 2022. That's the full pot of what's available. So please just make sure that your budget plans and corresponds accordingly with that. Okay. What's the highest and lowest amounts of the grant that one application can apply for, could be awarded, and how will this amount be decided? So there is no minimum size of application that you can submit, and on maximum, so I mean, in total, the county has $147 million to work with. If you look at the investment guidance that's on Cobb County's ARPA website, right now across those 5 priority areas and subtopics, there's about $108 million that's accounted for there. So that's the full pot of funding. But that funding is broken down and tagged to specific subtopics. So For example, if your project is going to really be in line with mental health and kind of serving those needs, take a look at that subtopic and what the allocated amount has been for that. That's essentially the maximum that you could apply for there. If your project is kind of multidimensional, we recognize that many of the needs are kind of interdependent. There's certainly they don't exist in silos. And for example, if your project would be a little bit mental health, a little bit, other kinds of support services, substance use, you could be drawing from both of those funding allocations. And so the amount that you could apply for could be a little bit higher. If you need a little bit more information on that, feel free to email us. If you can share a little bit of information about what it is you're interested in applying for, or the nature of the project you're trying to do, we can also work with you to just give you a little bit more of a tailored response to that question. Okay, and again, all that information can be found upfront in the introduction of the application. Okay, next question. Are the funds reimbursement or upfront? So as I noted, they will be, the funds may be distributed in different ways. At this time, I can't say definitively, how the funds would be distributed for your project. I think that will be taken into consideration a little bit, depending on the nature of your project. Depending on the nature of your project, depending on the duration, the amount that you're asking for. And so, yeah, we might need a little bit more information, kind of on what you're thinking of proposing on, or the amount and duration. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Can private schools apply for ARPA funds? So I think it depends here on what your intended project would be. If the scope and kind of the intended impact of the project is in line with the subtopics that have been identified, then that may be an eligible expense that may be considered. If it's for purposes that fall outside of that, then that would be outside the scope of what the county has chosen to prioritize at this time. How old does a nonprofit have to be in order to apply? Can the nonprofit be brand new? Will 990s be required? So nonprofits of any age are encouraged to apply. There is a question that I think asks for your date of founding in that upfront section for organizational information. We don't ask for 990s in the application itself, although those are often of public record. If it's within your first year of being a nonprofit and you don't have an audited 990 that's available yet, then we understand that you may not have that. Yeah, so certainly welcome to apply. I think in your application, what you would want to demonstrate is that you would want to demonstrate how you have the capacity, how you've demonstrated it, or how you would be able to administer this federal funding. Okay, and feel free to follow up with us, ARPA@cobbcounty.org, if you have any other specifics around that question. But no minimum or maximum date age of a nonprofit. Okay. The next question, so on priority 4.2 for stormwater, this subtopic says that it's only open to applicants for Cobb County government entities. Can residents apply for this? This is important. This is something I didn't note earlier when I was talking about the subtopics. So there are a few subtopics that are only open for Cobb County government, essentially Cobb County departments and agencies to apply for. And those are clearly indicated in the application. Stormwater is one of those that is for Cobb County government, again, because this application is not intended for households. If if you have a need that's kind of a collective infrastructure need, then we would encourage you to engage with the department or encourage them to submit an application from the county government level, because that's what that subtopic is allocated for. Okay. Next question is, can an application cover more than one of the community investment priorities? Yes, it absolutely can. We encourage you to select one main priority to focus the project on. And then if multiple priorities, multiple subtopics are involved, then you can build your budget based on what's allocated across all of those areas. But in your narrative, please do try and provide at least a focus point, or kind of what will be the largest component of the project that you're proposing. Can you review what expenses are and are not eligible for funding? For example, are capital expenses like construction allowed? This is a little bit of an it depends answer. Construction can certainly be an eligible expense if it aligns to one of the subtopics. And this may be an area where you might need to send us an email just providing a little bit more detail so we can take a closer look here. For example, there's a line item, not a line item, sorry, there's a subtopic for affordable housing. And under the ARPA guidelines, construction of affordable housing is an eligible expense, so capital expense, but also counseling around housing insecurity or households that are vulnerable or housing insecure, that's also an eligible expense. So it kind of depends on the nature of what's the project that you'd like to implement, and then which subtopic you're tagging that against. So we can look at those two things in conjunction and just make sure that it's indeed an eligible expense. Okay. Can you make this meeting recording available for online viewing later? Yes, so this webinar recording and the slides that we're using, these will be available on the Cobb County website. We're also going to be having a second webinar in about a week and a half time, I think on the 27th. The team can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong, where we'll answer additional questions as we expect. More questions will come in between now and then through that ARPA@cobbcounty.org email address. So if you find that you're working on your application, you have additional questions, you can either send them in or join the other webinar as well. And then all of this will be posted and available online. Okay. Next question, can the application be saved and worked on later? So the online application, it can't be saved. It's intended to be completed in one sitting. But we do recognize this may be a lot of information to pull together. And so you can request a PDF version of the application just to use to kind of draft your content and get it all ready so that when you go to the online application, you can load it all in at one time. Again, email us, ARPA@cobbcounty.org. We can send you that PDF version of the application. You can also print out and mail in that application, but we do encourage you to submit the application online if possible. It may help to just accelerate the review of your application. The PDF version, I will note, it does have information about how to submit it by mail, if that's something that you're interested in. Okay. Any special processes for applying for capital projects? Will any special reporting be required? There are some reporting requirements that are unique to capital projects. It depends a little bit on the nature of your capital project. For example, if it's housing construction of some kind versus if it's broadband of some kind, there's different requirements. And so we would share that with you once the project has been, once your application has been received, reviewed, and evaluated, if it's something that the county would like to recommend for the board, we'll be in touch with you at that time to discuss what some of those requirements would be, just to make sure that we're aligned, that you still want to proceed with the application. Okay, next question. Can an organization submit more than one proposal? Yes. Yes, you can. If the project name is different, even if the project contact and contact information is the same, we'll recognize that as a unique and distinct application. And so you could have multiple submissions that would be considered. Okay, will there be a process of submitting invoices for approval and then payment? So it's not, I would say it's not going to be uniform across the board that the payment disbursement of funds would be a reimbursement process. Even if you receive your funding upfront, you would still need to track your expenses, keep and maintain records of your invoices and your receipts and all of your expenses to submit as part of your reporting. That would all be detailed for you. Again, if your project would be recommended and going to the board for approval, we'll be in touch at that time to discuss more of the kind of the nitty gritty and the specifics around the compliance that's required. Okay. Next question, if the full grant request cannot be awarded, will partial grants be approved? Yes, partial grants may be approved, and that's a little bit at the discretion of the county as they evaluate the application, and then also the board as they ultimately approve. That would be a time, again, where it's important, where we would be in touch with you if that project is going to go before the board for approval, because we wouldn't want to approve an amount that, you might say, this is partial, I can't actually implement this with this amount of funding. We would be in touch with you before it goes to the board, just to, again, get on the same page if partial funding is under consideration. Okay. Let's see. I have a nonprofit. Can I be a part of getting funds? Yep, nonprofits are eligible to apply for these funds. They're encouraged to apply. Take a look through the application, that upfront section, and see if any of those subtopics align to what your nonprofit does. And if interested, if you have a project idea, then go ahead and submit that. If I have two subtopics submitted within one application, can one subtopic be declined and the other approved, or would the entire application be denied? If one subtopic is not approved, but the other subtopic or the project you're proposing for the other subtopic is compelling, then that other subtopic, it could still be considered. For that, I would say if these two subtopics are related, and if the way you're designing your project is kind of integrated, then put those in one application. If they're two things that could be discrete and they're sort of separate, then go ahead and submit two. Yeah, okay. Next question, is payroll that's specific to a project an eligible expense to be covered with the grant? Yes, payroll may be covered under overhead costs. So Treasury recognizes that to implement these programs, you need staff to do so, and that's an expense which is certainly eligible. If you have any more specifics around that, just send us an email. We can get you a more tailored answer. Okay. Next question, can you explain again where we would find the maximum amount that we can apply for under a certain priority subgroup? So specifically mental health. Sure, so actually I have the list in front of me right here. If you go to the online application itself, in that upfront introduction section, the subtopics are all listed there, along with a brief description of the subtopic and the allocated amounts. You can find it there. Under mental health specifically, $12.1 million has been approved for mental health, and that would span addressing mental health, the provision of mental health services for the public, including services for seniors and youth. So it's a pretty broad remit there as far as scope of mental health services and support there. Okay. Can you describe the reporting requirements, as these could impact the decisions to apply? Perhaps we can share the link, just because the reporting requirements that I noted, they do depend a little bit on what specifically it is that you're applying for. Treasury has issued guidance. There's a PDF document. It's the compliance and reporting requirements. And so if you already know specifically what your project will be about, you can look in that document and see if there are any special reporting requirements that you would have. That document, it's geared towards the county and what the county is responsible to report on a quarterly and a yearly basis. But all the inputs to that report would be coming from you and the other subrecipients who are implementing projects, right? That's essentially what we'll be asking you to report on. So I don't know if it's possible for the team to share that link there to the Treasury reporting guidance. Yep, there we go. Thank you. Okay. Is there a budget template within the application, or is there flexibility to create our own? So there's flexibility to create your own. We've just provided some very high level guidance of what we're looking for based on pretty standard details that you would include in a budget. If there's something that you typically use, we encourage you to do that, especially if you're applying for a larger grant, multi-year grant, or a grant where you would be applying with multiple organizations. So do feel free to create your own budget format template, amount of detail, and submit that. Okay, we've got just 2 minutes left here. And so I just want to recap on the next slide some of the kind of really foundational information. So how are applications submitted? The applications can be submitted online, and Sarah, if you just click the URL, will pop up for folks to see. So the online application can be submitted at the Cobb County ARPA website. Again, if you need a PDF version of the application, send us an email. It's available in English and in Spanish, so that you can review that offline and develop your content if needed. When is the application deadline? The application deadline is September 9th, 5 p.m. Eastern, with the caveat that if any funding remains at that time, that it will be at the discretion of the Board of Commissioners on how they'd like to handle that. Can I submit a project idea? So if you have an idea that's not quite a fully fleshed out proposal, if you're an individual with an idea, then yes, you can still submit the idea. Just answer the corresponding questions in the application where it notes, are you applying as an individual, as an organization? Do you have the capacity to implement this? Is there a minimum or maximum amount of funding? Someone asked us during the session, no minimum amount of funding. And then as far as maximum, really look to that introduction section of the application where it lists all of the subtopics and the approved allocated amounts, and use that as your guideline for how much funding you can apply for. Can I collaborate with other organizations? Yes, absolutely, and this is encouraged. If you do so, we would recommend that one organization is designated as the lead, or essentially like the prime on the application, and to submit one-off application with that organization in the lead. In section 4 of the application, you can note who the other partner organizations are, and in the details of the application, please do note where the other organizations are coming into play. How will I be notified? once funding decisions are made. So throughout the process, there will be a couple of points of communication. We'll acknowledge when your application's been received. If any clarification is needed, we may be in touch with you then in the interim. And then once the county has evaluated applications and is putting recommendations forward to the board, you'll be notified if your application is being recommended or not. All right. I think we are at time. Recognize that some of you may still have outstanding questions. Feel free to send those to ARPA@cobbcounty.org. We'll continue to work to answer those offline. If you have more specifics on what it is that you're interested to propose on, send us those questions and those details, and we'll be able to provide a little bit more tailored response for you. Okay. Thank you all so much for your time and for joining. Thanks for your interest in the application and in putting together some projects for the benefit of Cobb County. We're excited to see what comes in. We've already received a couple of applications and look forward to hearing from all of you. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good evening.